Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, and welcome if you are new here. I'm Andrea.M. and this is Real Crime Down Under. And in today's video we will be taking a slightly different approach, and we will be exploring the top 10 most callous and vicious murders that happened in Australia during the 1800s, and this will harken back to the time of penal colonies and bushrangers, and into some of the darker history of early Australia. And I need to give a warning that these stories are quite detailed and graphic, so viewer discretion is advised. But before we embark on today's rather grisly countdown, if you enjoy real crime, the paranormal, true disasters, the missing, and a little bit of folklore thrown in with a distinctly Australian flavour, then you've come to just the right channel for yourself, as that's mainly all that I do here. So if this sounds really good to you and you like it, could you please do me the huge favour of repeatedly crank calling the like button, stalk the subscribe button, and make a serial pest of the share button. And also feel free to drop a comment or two on today's video in the comment section below, as it is truly wonderful subscribers like your good selves that help me to grow my channel here on YouTube and continue to bring content to you guys just like this. And with the formalities out of the way, let's begin. And we'll be starting with number 10 on the countdown. Number 10, the baby farming murder. And this is exactly what it sounds like, so please be advised. While tending to a communal garden in Moreland Road, Coburg, a man unearthed the lifeless remains of an infant. Following a police investigation, a second child's body was discovered with tape tightly wound around the boy's neck. The atrocity of this sickening crime ultimately led police to Frances Lydia Alice Knorr, a 23-year-old English migrant working as a domestic servant. Baby farming, as it was known, was a common occupation where working-class women were hired to care for so-called illegitimate children. Much public opposition arose subsequent to Knorr's trial and death sentence, particularly from women and church groups. The escalating, emotion-charged outpouring of sympathy became an immense burden for the guy who was going to be doing the executioner Thomas Jones. He was feeling pressure and disdain from both the public and also from his own wife. 2 days before Jones was to meet Knorr at the gallows, the hangman would take his own life. Nevertheless, Jones was replaced by a man named Roberts, who saw to it that Knorr would hang in the early hours of January 15, 1894. In spite of Knorr's incessant claims of innocence, authorities discovered a penned confession in her cell following her execution that read, "I express a strong desire that this statement be made public, with the hope that my fate will not only be a warning to others, but also to act as a deterrent to those who are perhaps carrying on the same practice." Further inquiries later revealed that Knorr was responsible for more than a dozen other infants' deaths. Number 9, the Stringy Bark Creek Massacre, and this involves our most famous bushranger ever, Ned Kelly. In October 1878, the Kelly gang was on the run, hiding out in the wild bushlands of northeast Victoria. With their whereabouts narrowed down, 4 officers were dispatched to apprehend the murderous outlaws, eventually setting up camp at Stringy Bark Creek. But unbeknownst to the officers, the Kelly gang was well aware of their location and was patiently waiting in the brush for an opportune moment to execute their ambush. In a profound lapse of judgment, Sergeant Kennedy and Constable Scanlon would leave the camp at dawn to search for the gang, and that would leave their partners Lonergan and McIntyre behind, vulnerable and extremely outnumbered. The Kelly gang ambushed the camp in the late afternoon, whereupon they immediately executed Lonergan. Over the next several hours, McIntyre was held at gunpoint, knowing full well the fate that awaited his unsuspecting comrades upon their return. When they returned, a barrage of gunfire erupted while Constable Scanlon's mortally wounded body fell to the ground. A weaponless McIntyre leapt onto a horse that had bolted in the onslaught, leaving a doomed Kennedy in the dust. Public outrage to the triple murder was swift and tremendous, with the state of Victoria officially declaring the Kelly gang as outlaws. Thus, it was legal to shoot and kill Ned Kelly, Dan Kelly, Joe Byrne, and Steve Hart, and these were the members of the Kelly gang. They were issued a kill-on-sight order without even an attempt of an arrest. Surprisingly, the gang would go on to live another 2 years, despite the overwhelming odds mobilised against them. In the years that followed, locals began flocking to Stringy Bark Creek to observe the morbid piece of Australian history. And I will be doing a whole episode on Ned Kelly and his gang in a future Real Crime Down Under, so stay tuned for that. At number 8, we have Joseph Thayer. It was a Monday afternoon, October 12, 1896, when 17-year-old George Albert Thayer returned to the family farm after spending the weekend away. Immediately upon his arrival, George noticed something hanging in the stockyard, a mere 91 metres or 300 feet from the entrance of the home. As he would move closer to find out what actually was hanging there, he would discover it was the body of his father, 44-year-old Joseph Thayer. Frantic and distraught, George ran inside the house, only to find the bloodied and disfigured bodies of his mother and younger siblings. 36-year-old Elizabeth, their mother, Florence, 12, Edward, 9, Alexander, 7, Charlie, 6, Roy, 4 months. Their skulls split open with an unknown blunt weapon. 3 of the victims were struck multiple times with such a force that the top parts of their skulls were entirely removed. Joseph Thayer had killed them all before hanging himself. It would be another 2 days until their corpses were removed from the gruesome scene. In the 3 blistering days that elapsed, the strongest disinfectants were required by the undertaker in an attempt to lessen the haunting and repulsive stench of death and decay. Settlers in neighbouring localities were beside themselves after hearing the news of such a butchery at the hands of Mr. Thayer, a well-known, reserved and highly respected man in Cavenagh, South Australia. In spite of his perceived character, Joseph Thayer actually had a very violent temper and had been complaining of pains in his head in the weeks leading up to the murders. On October 14, Elizabeth and Florence were placed in a casket, while the 4 boys were put into 2 separate caskets, 2 boys per coffin. The 4 caskets were then lowered into the ground together in one grave. Fittingly, the body of the craven savage who snuffed out their lives was buried alone in a separate plot. And following this, we have another family tragedy, unfortunately, at number 7, and this one would be the Glover family tragedy. So, with the nation still reeling from the Thayer family murder, a similar act of unspeakable violence would shock the quiet little community of Triabunna in 1898. On the first day of March, watch housekeeper George Glover was notified by his eldest daughter that his wife Mary Catherine and their 6 younger children were all missing. Over the next several hours, local businesses suspended operations, with every man in town volunteering to form a search party. Before dusk that evening, the town's worst nightmare had come to fruition. Combing through the bush with his trusted spaniel, storekeeper Edward Ford found the bodies of the 6 youths, ranging from 4 months to 11 years. They were lying together, covered in bloody blankets and shawls. Their throats had been slit from ear to ear, and based on appearances, it was theorised that the children had been sleeping or were drugged at the time of the murder. Upon news of the slayings, the great anxiety overtook the town, not due to Mrs. Glover's well-being, but to her unknown whereabouts. And Mrs. Glover had been described as a peculiar woman with a history of depression, and locals were worried that Mary was eluding capture with the intention of murdering her two eldest daughters, who obviously had not been at home at the time that the other siblings had been killed and were still alive. Such speculations, however, would be rendered forever moot upon the discovery of her body more than 1.6 kilometres, just about a mile outside of the town. She would be found lying face down in shallow water, not more than 0.6 metres or 2 feet deep, and it had appeared that Mary had attempted but failed to cut her own throat prior to the drowning. All that remained for detectives in the end was the rolled up cash in Mary's pockets, the murder weapon stained in her children's blood, and an eternity of unanswered questions. So I think it's pretty safe to say that in a modern climate, Mary probably would have been treated and talked to a counsellor or somebody about having postnatal depression. They didn't even have a term for it back then. I think they just used to call it like melancholia or something like that, mother's melancholia. So there was no facilities around to help mothers who were feeling overwhelmed back then. And back then also there was not a lot of birth control available, and a lot of it was kind of considered taboo because of religious reasons and other reasons, I guess. So these women were actually just having child after child after child after child, and it is expected that some of them would be feeling extremely overwhelmed if they weren't, getting the support from their husbands, or their husbands were unable to give them support because they would be out working the land. It's easy to see how somebody could become overwhelmed with such unfortunate and tragic circumstances. So from there, we're going to move on to number 6. On December 31, 1825, a man named Thomas Jeffries broke out of the Launceston Watch House in Van Diemen's Land, which is now present-day Tasmania. He was accompanied by fellow jailbirds John Perry, James Hopkins, and a man only identified as Russell. That evening, the 4 men broke into the residence of a respected settler named Tibbs, who, along with his wife and male servant, soon found themselves being tied up by these infernal intruders. In that moment, a struggle ensued and shots were fired. As the 2 innocent men's bullet-riddled bodies lay lifeless on the ground, Mrs. Tibbs and her infant son were led to the forest in the dark of night. In the seclusion of the woodlands, Jeffries forcefully snatched, and this is going to be very hard to hear, so if you're very sensitive to this kind of content, please skip forward at least 5 minutes, because it depicts the death of a child. Jeffries would forcefully snatch the 5-month-old baby from his mother's shielding arms and would bash him to death against a tree while she watched. The dreadful degree of the true horrors of that evening becoming apparent among locals around a week later, and that was when somebody would discover the unfortunate body of the baby in the bush there, and there was nothing left of the little baby more than just some flesh and bone, and it is thought that the animals had actually gotten to the body after death. During this time, Jeffries and his partners remained at large, with the exception of Russell, and this is also another awful thing, so maybe skip forward a little bit. He had been shot and was partly eaten by the 2 other men. Jeffries and Perry would be captured a few days later after the murder of Magnus Backey, for which they would stand trial. During court testimony, Mrs. Tibbs, who was sexually assaulted and left to die in the woods, collapsed upon seeing her child's killers. On May 4, 1826, Jeffries and Perry were led to the gallows and hanged. Number 5 is Frederick Bailey Deeming, conman and murderer. Frederick Bailey Deeming had already spent the majority of his life in and out of prison by the time he married Marie James in England in 1881. Having 4 children with Marie did not stop Deeming's bigamist heart from marrying Helen Matheson in 1890. As if juggling 2 families wasn't enough, Mr. Ladykiller, no pun intended, added another notch to his blissful union belt in September 1891 to Emily Lydia Mather, 3 months later, the newlyweds would move to Windsor in Australia, where they rented a brick cottage which still stands at 57 Andrew Street, and if I can find a photo of this cottage, I will pop it in. A little over a week later, on Christmas Day, the ever so charming philanderer bludgeoned Emily, slit her throat, and then buried her naked body beneath the hearthstone of their bedroom. The following month, the cold-blooded killer sailed to Sydney, where he immediately became engaged to a woman named Kate Rounsfell. Fortunately for Kate, however, his newfound love interest, their whirlwind romance would be very short-lived, due to the putrid smell emanating from the floorboards of the Windsor cottage. Emily's decomposing remains were discovered, leading to Deeming's arrest in Western Australia. When the news made its way back to England, Emily's grieving mother recalled floor work her murderous son-in-law had done at his former home in Rain Hill. Due to this, local authorities excavated the floors of the couple's previous residence, only to discover Deeming's first wife, Marie, and their 4 young children entombed in concrete. The savagery of the crimes became a media spectacle, with the press accusing Deeming of being Jack the Ripper. Overnight, newspapers nationwide labelled him as the Jack the Ripper of the Southern Seas. In all the time during his trial, he neither confessed nor denied to being the Ripper, and this was possibly due to the fact that he undoubtedly relished the fame. On May 23, 1892, Deeming enjoyed one last cigar as he walked to the gallows in front of a crowd of 12,000 enthusiastic spectators. Number 4. The Gatton Murders. On the night of December 26, 1898, Michael Murphy, 29, and his sisters Nora, 27, and Teresa Ellen, 19, made their way to a dance in the small town of Gatton. The following morning, the 3 had yet to return to the Murphy farm, prompting a search that would lead to their grisly discovery in a secluded pasture. Lying neatly beside one another with their feet pointing to the west, it appeared that the siblings' blood-soaked corpses were posed by their killer. While ants crawled across their lifeless bodies, the investigators noted that the girls' hands had been bound and that they had possibly been interfered with a brass-mounted handle of a riding whip. Furthermore, all 3 were bludgeoned to such an extent that Nora's brains masked her face. The callous killer didn't even bother to spare Murphy's horse, which was found shot in the head a few yards away. The subsequent investigation by authorities was the epitome of incompetence, given the myriad of illogical mistakes that were made by the investigators at this time. Case in point, it took 2 days for investigators from Brisbane to arrive at the scene of the crime, and by that time, locals who were curious about what had happened had unreservedly contaminated the crime scene. Throughout the years of speculation, one man has been singled out as a likely culprit, and his name was Thomas Day, and he was a local butcher who was seen lurking near the crime scene on the night of the murders. Weeks prior to the Murphy slayings, Day was suspected in the killing of a 15-year-old named Alfred Stephen Hill, and his pony was also found with a single bullet to its head a few yards away from his body. In 1900, Day shot himself in the head and died in the Sydney hospital. More than a century later, the Gatton murders still remain unsolved. Number 3, the Cape Grim Massacre. In the early 1800s, the majority of the Aboriginal people of northwestern Tasmania were hunted down and slaughtered in an attempt of genocide led by the VDL Company hunting expeditions. According to the company's chief agent, Robert Kerr, we have to lament that our own countrymen consider the massacre of these people an honour, which kind of says to me that the organisers of said hunting trips were probably not too impressed by what their clients were hunting. By December 1827, complacency among the Aboriginal people had ceased, and reprisal attacks, something seldom seen before, were beginning to escalate. Following the murder of numerous Aboriginal men who died protecting their women from sexual assault, the natives exacted their revenge by driving over 100 sheep belonging to this company off a cliff. And sheep were actually a form of currency back then, so this would have been a tremendous loss to the company. This led to a company punitive expedition in 1828, resulting in the butchery of 12 Aboriginals following the sneak attack. The bloodshed only worsened in the days that followed when the same party of murderous shepherds encountered another group of Aboriginal people. On that day, February 10, around 30 terrified natives were systematically massacred before their bodies were thrown off the 60-metre, 200-foot cliff in what is now remembered as the Cape Grim Massacre. Such appalling brutality continued in the years to come, with the Lieutenant Governor declaring martial law, which permitted the capture or murder of Aboriginal people. By 1830, an estimated 60 Aboriginals of the Northwest Tribe remained. And at number 2, we have yet another massacre, the Maria Shipwreck Massacre, and it is one of the most controversial events in Australian maritime history, and it began on June 26, 1840, when 26 souls left Port Adelaide on the brigantine Maria. The vessel was bound for Hobart under Captain William Smith. However, it foundered for unknown reasons off the coast of Kingston. With fading hope for Maria's anticipated arrival, reports began circulating that all aboard were murdered by natives after a massacre site was discovered along the coastline. This spawned a party of men to investigate, all of whom described finding the legs, arms, and parts of bodies partially covered with sand and strewn in all directions. Wedding rings found on the slain bodies of 2 female passengers were recovered, in addition to the men describing how they had witnessed a native wearing a sailor's jacket. As the public's ire progressively escalated, Governor George Gawler instructed Major Thomas O'Halloran to lead a team on horseback and perpetuate retribution upon those responsible. Specifically, once identifying those he believed to be the culprits, Major O'Halloran was ordered to serenely explain to the natives the nature of your conduct, and you will deliberately and formally cause sentence of death to be executed by shooting or hanging. The Major did just that, and on the 25th of August of that year, 2 natives were hanged beside the graves of their alleged victims. And that leads us to number 1, and the final crime on our rather grisly hit parade today, the Cullen Laringo Massacre. As we have already seen, the colonial government was committed to ridding the land of the Aboriginal people through callous and unwanted bloodshed. Such was the case in October 1861, when members of the local Gayeri were shot by Jesse Gregson, along with the 2nd Lieutenant Patrick and his native police troopers. Gregson, who managed the Rainworth station, had accused the tribesmen of stealing a flock of sheep. On October 17, in a retaliatory response, local tribesmen slaughtered 19 white settlers, including women and children, in what is now known as the Cullen Laringo Massacre, the largest mass murder of settlers by the native people in Australian history. It became apparent only after the senseless carnage that Gregson's sheep were not stolen, as they were later found having wandered from their pasture. Nonetheless, another retaliatory attack was inevitable. Soon after the massacre at Cullen Laringo, 7 native police detachments were deployed by the colonial Queensland government, resulting in the slaughter of 300 to 370 tribespeople. Champion sportsman Thomas Wentworth Wills was Australia's first cricketer of significance. Being one of the few survivors who narrowly escaped death at Cullen Laringo, Wills witnessed the murder of his father on that fateful October day. The frame of mind of the once nationally acclaimed athlete was forever detrimentally changed, and he resorted to alcohol to escape his torments. By 1869, his career was in ruins and his temperament was degrading. Wills was eventually confined at the Kew Lunatic Asylum, and on May 2, 1880, he took his own life at the age of 43. And that brings us to the end of that rather grisly list of Australian real crime that happened back in the colonial era. Honestly, I came across this list by accident. I was actually looking for crimes during the convict era in Australia. My Ghosts of Port Arthur video I uploaded for the Oz Files on Friday really piqued my interest into the historical crimes from way back when the country was first being settled. And I had no idea that anything on that list had ever even occurred, apart from Ned Kelly and his gang. And if you grow up in Australia, you just know who Ned Kelly was. Everybody knows Ned Kelly. So what do you guys think? Did you find today's video interesting? I found myself actually that it was pretty disturbing, but it was typical of that time in history. You usually find in most countries during the establishment years that a lot of horrific crimes were committed and often just get lost to history. So that's about it for today's video. Let me know what you thought of it. Have you ever heard of any of the lesser known crimes from way back when that I did cover today? What was your take on Ned Kelly? Do you have any stories from your own families, if you grew up in Australia, that they told you about Ned and his gang? I'll be interested to know. So any thoughts that you have or theories on today's video, I'd love to hear it in the comments section below. That's about it for today's video. Join me for another Disaster Down Under, also coming this week, where I will be covering the Ash Wednesday fires from 1983. There will also be another Missing Down Under and another episode of the Oz Files to ponder and wonder about. And don't miss our first investigation of the year for Clarence Valley Paranormal. That will be coming up in about 3 weeks. I'm so excited about it. And I cannot wait to go and investigate where we're going to investigate and to shoot the videos. So if you love our Clarence Valley Paranormal videos and investigations, please stay tuned for that, because it's coming very, very soon and I'm really excited about it. So that being said, thank you all once again so much for watching. Thank you for supporting my channel and for supporting me. I am still a relatively new content creator, so everybody who likes, shares, comments, subscribes, and just supports me, it is so appreciated. I am trying to grow my channel so that I can become a part of the partnership program, but I need 1,000 subscribers to get there. So if you would like to help me get there, please don't hesitate to subscribe and tap the bell button, as I have a lot of interesting videos and a lot of on-location shooting coming up for Clarence Valley Paranormal that you're not going to want to miss. So all that being said, thank you all again so much. Have a great day, everybody. Have a great week. Please stay safe and stay aware. Much love, and I'll see you all back here again soon.